In this video, I'm going to discuss the banana boom in Latin America, and specifically it occurred in Central America and the Caribbean Basin. And the banana boom begins in the last quarter of the 19th century, and it really goes on until the present day. Bananas, as we all know, are a very common commodity we see in grocery stores. And bananas are also really interesting because it was through the banana that many Americans first came to know Latin America. And this slender fruit, it helped to define everyday consumer culture in the United States. So in 1910, over 40 million bunches of bananas entered U.S. ports. And just 4 years later, the U.S. imported 50 million bunches. And your average American in the 1910s was consuming about 22 pounds of bananas every year. And by the 1920s, the banana was the only fresh fruit eaten in greater quantities in the United States than the apple. So first Americans ate the apple and then bananas by the 1920s. And the banana is also interesting because it has all these metaphorical connotations in the United States. So you've heard phrases such as going bananas, the top banana, and banana republic, maybe you've heard of as well. And all these kind of phrases enter the American lexicon in the early 20th centuries. And before going on into some detail about the banana industry, I want to talk about this phrase, the banana republic. A banana republic is a small, backward, and corrupt country ruled by a dictator. And this is important because I see this phrase used a lot to describe politics in Latin America when I read the newspaper. Maybe you've heard of it as well. And it's become a powerful metaphor for the way Americans see our neighbors in countries such as Central America. This metaphor has been used to justify and explain U.S. interventions in Latin America. Often in the American view, we see countries such as El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras as just banana republics. And when U.S. interventions in these countries occur, it's also often portrayed as the United States is intervening to uplift these countries and bring them democracies and to help improve their corrupt political systems. That's how the term banana republic has been used historically. And personally, I'm critical of this term banana republic. Not only because it portrays these countries very simplistically and easily exploitable, but it also masks the way in which monopoly capitalism in the United States shaped the 20th century banana trade. And I think this will become clear as we move forward. Bananas arrived in the Americas during the Columbian Exchange. They're originally from Southeast Asia. And for many centuries, until about 1850, they were largely confined to the tropics. And they were grown along sugarcane, for example, in regions such as Brazil and the Caribbean. And the slaves grew a lot of bananas because it was a healthy fruit that they consumed. And bananas are high-yielding plants. They require little labor, and they're easy to make into food. And after emancipation in the Caribbean in the mid-19th century, former slaves would often sell bananas to American visitors at the port cities. By the late 19th century, U.S. corporations began to establish banana plantations in Central America and the Caribbean Basin. These companies included the United Fruit Company, Standard Fruit, and Cuyamel. And United Fruit is the most famous or infamous of these fruit companies, as we'll see. We'll be reading quite a bit about the United Fruit Company in the coming weeks. Governments in Latin America welcomed these companies and gave them tax concessions, cheap land, and access to water and timber. And they also provided concessions to build railroads that linked the plantations to the ports. And the banana companies came to own and control hundreds of thousands of acres of lands in these countries. Usually, one or two banana companies dominated in each country. And these companies, they actually pioneered business organization, such as vertical integration. And vertical integration is when a company controls the production process, transportation, and distribution of the bananas. And this had to do with the fact that, as you all know, bananas spoil very quickly. And it was important for the companies to get the bananas from places such as Honduras to the supermarkets in the United States before they spoiled. And so if they could control the production process and transportation and distribution, then that was a good way to make sure that the bananas arrived on time. You know, as we all know, none of us will buy rotten bananas in the grocery store. We quickly look for the fresh and or the green, ripe bananas. And on the plantations, the managers of the banana plantations were often Americans, white Americans, and they were provided with very nice company housing. And they would usually be given access to medical services, and they might even have a movie theater for the managers. And they were also paid in gold coins. And on the other hand, the rank and file workers, who were all locals from the Caribbean and Central America, they often had company housing that was much less quality. And the local workers, they weren't paid in gold coins. Instead, they were paid in the local script. And the local currency obviously was much less valuable than gold coins. And a lot of these local workers were people of color, as you see here on the image. And so basically the banana companies were bringing segregationist practices to the plantations and to work in Latin America. And every time the local workers would try to organize a union to fight for better wages or better working conditions or access to health services, the companies fervently resisted these efforts by the local workers. And we'll see this in our readings as in the next few weeks about how these segregationist practices and this bad treatment of the local workers, it stirred resentment and nationalism among the workers on the banana plantations. So next week we'll actually be reading about the 1929 Banana Massacre in Colombia, and we'll also have some readings in the Guatemala Reader about the United Fruit Company. And these banana companies were extremely powerful in Latin America. They often rivaled the power of the local governments. The local governments were dependent on these companies for tax revenues. And so the local governments would bend over backwards to make sure that the banana companies were happy. And the banana companies, usually there was just one or two in each country. And if they didn't like the way things are going or their relationship with the government or the workers were starting to organize a union, they would often just threaten to pick up operations and move to the next country. And so Latin America was very vulnerable to the banana companies, as we'll see. And when we come to the Guatemalan Revolution, which we'll read a lot about, it took place in the 1950s. The conflict with the United Fruit Company was really at the heart of the Guatemalan Revolution, as we'll see.